Okay, so share the screen. There we go. All right, so what happened? Is my screen shared? Can somebody confirm?
Yes, Neville is shared.
Great. Okay, well, I'm like really almost there. Good. Okay. So thanks very much, everybody, and welcome. I'm Neville Sweijd. I'll take 2 minutes and then hand over to Wendy Foden. Just to say that this meeting is being done in conjunction with my partners for this event, which Wendy will tell us a bit more about, ICN and Sandbox. But what I want to just say is that the Access Program is running a series of events, of which this counts as one. And these are just headline events to kind of spawn further and in-depth discussion on climate and climate change related matters. The goal is to get informed about fundamental elements and broaden transdisciplinary thinking, and to put climate change back on the agenda since it was swept away by COVID-19 last year, and then to enhance networks really. And we have a series of talks. We've had 2, this is the 3rd, and there's a number of other topics we're going to be tackling in the next couple of months. Next one will be on the cryosphere. We'll look at climate and health, some of the economics. We'll look at COP, oceans, and some politics as well. Those will be upcoming events which all those who have registered will hear about. There is a YouTube channel which you can find if you look for the Access Program on YouTube for the previous events, which were on climate change law and on wildfires. So this week we're dealing with the biodiversity question, which Wendy will introduce a bit more, and then hand over to our hosts, our guests. And then I just wanted to mention that we're starting something new, which is a online journal club, which I will also advertise once at least to all of you, which is really to look at the literature, the current literature in a sort of informal framework. And so that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you all very much. And thanks to our participants. And hereby hand over to Wendy, and I'll unshare my screen. Thanks.
Thanks, Neville, and thanks for that that welcome. So it serves for me just to welcome our 2 other sort of stakeholder groups who are co-hosting this. Firstly, South African National Parks, the Cape Research Centre has a webinar series, and we're very glad to welcome all of our SANParks team and stakeholders. So that gets us a lovely network across South Africa. And last but not least, the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Climate Change Specialist Group. And I see a number of our members and international stakeholders who joined us through that network. Really exciting for those who don't know, it's a group that really seeks to join science, policy and practice and strengthen the interlinkages between them. And I think this is a fantastic example of just that. Our next symposium is again a joint one. It's a biodiversity focused one, joint between the SANParks Cape Research Centre and the IUCN Climate Change Specialist Group. And that deals with protected areas and managing ecosystem change, how we cope with climate change in terms of our overall approach to conservation. So that will be sent around through those 2 networks. And feel free to go and check out our web pages. I think many of you will have received an email from Wudzani Poppe. If you want to, if you want to get onto the other 2 distributions, just pop Wudzi a note. Great, that's all from me. And I'd like to hand over to Dani Govender. She's the leader of South African National Parks Scientific Services Savanna and Grass node. And Dani, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. So firstly, welcome everybody. I'm not going to really share my screen. I'm going to take a moment just to firstly thank Neville and Wendy for organizing this. I think it's a great opportunity, and also for providing a little bit of a welcome and an intro. And then sorry that we couldn't keep you in the waiting room and start off with having the sort of back of house organized before, and your patience for bearing with us. So remember, we're not going to be having a question and answer session after each speaker. We're going to actually just park those questions in the chat room, and then we'll cover it at the end of the last speaker. So we all know 2020, the global pandemic has been quite a year, and it's indeed forced us all to take stock of our relationship with the planet. And as the world plans to build back better and engage in a new Green Deal, we thought it was important to reflect on important lessons coming out of these 3 reports. Not to fill you with dread and apathy about the future, but really to stress the urgency for strong and decided leadership and a call to action and at scale that's required if we really are going to halt the ongoing onslaught of biodiversity loss and to restore our planet's life systems. So we've come to actually realize that our continued growth, our consumption patterns, our over-reliance on fossil fuels, they actually threaten our life systems. And that concentrating on just the environmental sustainable goals by themselves, on which we're also failing, cannot be seen as separate from other human development goals. So they're very interdependent, and the bedrock on which our socioeconomic future depends. So as we take stock of where we are, we're very privileged to go on this journey with 3 eminent leaders in their fields who have contributed to these global assessments. So it's sort of straight from the horse's mouth. So I'd like to just then ask Tim to start sharing his screen very soon and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tim Hirsch. Tim has had an unconventional career path leading from 20 years in journalism through science communication consultancy to leadership and global advocacy in the sharing of biodiversity information. As Deputy Director and Head of Participation and Engagement at the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, Tim leads the team that supports Dziba's network of national and thematic nodes, sharing data for biodiversity research and policy, manages capacity enhancement programs. He collaborates with related networks and organizations around the world and communicates Dziba's activities. Tim has worked as a science writer with the CBD to co-author the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook reports. It is therefore a huge privilege to have Tim with us today to share some of the GBO5 report's findings. Tim, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Danny, for that welcome, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be speaking to you all at this wonderfully well-attended event. I'm really impressed by the number of people who are online here. So, as you mentioned, I'm going to give a bit of a perspective of what the main findings of. I will first give it its full name, the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, and from now on, I'm probably going to call it GBO5 to just go through what some of the main findings were, but with a particular focus on how this relates to the climate change issue. So first of all, just to put the report in perspective, it's obviously by its name, the 5th of a series, but the last 3 of these global biodiversity outlooks really framed what was the UN decade on biodiversity. So 2011 to 2020 was declared the UN decade on biodiversity. So GBO3, the 3rd outlook, was published just before the meeting in Nagoya, Japan, where the Aichi biodiversity targets were set as part of the strategic plan for the UN decade. Then there was a midterm assessment of how those targets were going, which was the 4th biodiversity outlook at GBO4. And then the latest one, GBO5, which I'll be focused on, was published in September of last year, 2020, and was really a final evaluation at the end of that decade in terms of how the world had done in achieving the targets that had been set back in 2010. In terms of the sources of information, Obviously, it's a relatively short, compact report that brings together a huge range and variety of different sources of information. This gives just a little bit of a summary of that variety. So it was building very much on work that we'll be hearing about later from Luthando, the IPBES assessments, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in particular the global assessment that came out in April 2019, and other IPBES reports. Crucially, what we were able to add for the GBO5 was a huge diversity of information that was coming through to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, through the national reports from over 150 parties or countries. There were also a range of indicators that are provided through an organization called the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. Those were brought up to date to give us the best evaluation of how, to what extent the targets had been achieved. A broad range of additional research that had come out in the literature, and there was quite a flurry of research in that super year for biodiversity last year. And a number of big additional reports, including, for example, from the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and indeed reports such as the Living Planet report that we'll be hearing about next, and some additional work that was done specifically for GBO5 relating to scenarios. So that was the kind of the building blocks for what was provided in the report. It was divided into 3 sections, starting out with an evaluation of the linkages between biodiversity and other aspects of sustainable development, including, of course, climate change. The core part in the middle, part 2, was that sort of report card evaluating target by target, how the world had responded to those pledges at the beginning of the decade. And then a forward-looking section that was entitled Pathways to the 2050 Vision for Biodiversity. So in other words, what options are there still available for the world to get on track towards a world in which we are living in harmony with nature by the middle of the current century. And you'll see at the bottom there the URL cbd.int/GBO5 if you want to have a look in detail at the report. So just I'm just going to take one slide from that opening section in terms of the linkages between biodiversity and the Sustainable Development Goals, because it speaks very much to the point that Danny was making at the beginning, the way in which all of the Sustainable Development Goals are linked and interdependent. So it's a rather complicated diagram here, as you don't try to look too much into the detail, but essentially this was showing the way in which the state of biodiversity itself affects and contributes to achievement of other SDGs in that middle column, and then conversely on the right, the extent to which the individual SDGs impact on biodiversity. And I've just put a red box around SDG 13 climate action to make the perhaps fairly obvious point, but a point that I think we need to continue to make, that there is complete and full interdependency between what happens to biodiversity and where the world goes on climate change. So the plus means that there is a very clear direct impact on the SDG relating to climate from the state of biodiversity. The exclamation mark means that conversely, if biodiversity declines, it will have a detrimental impact on efforts to tackle climate change. And then on the right, it really shows that in the other direction, what happens to climate has a very strong impact on the state of biodiversity. And the little circle to the right of that also shows that there are what are termed constraints. In other words, depending on what choices are made in terms of achieving, in this case, tackling climate change, that can have either positive or negative impacts on biodiversity. So In other words, there are potential trade-offs depending on what climate solutions are selected in terms of achieving our goals for biodiversity, and I'll mention those a little bit later on. So in terms of that report card, this is an overall summary of how the extent to which the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets were or were not achieved. You can see that those semicircles are divided up into different components because each of the Aichi biodiversity targets themselves had different elements. And so rather than simply being able to say a target was or was not met, in the wording of the targets, there were some aspects where you could say there was more or less progress than other aspects. Where there is green, it means that that component of the target was judged to have been achieved or met by 2020. Where there was yellow, that's where there was progress but not sufficient to meet that component of the target. Where there's red, there was no significant progress over the decade. Where there is purple, things were actually moving in the wrong direction for the decade. And in the one case where there is blue, that was a case where that component was actually achieved beyond what was set in the target. And then a couple of grays where there isn't enough information. So what's the overall message from that? Well, unfortunately, what you can see from that is that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets was fully achieved because it would have to be all green for that to be the case. However, there are some targets where there are some green components where we can say that those targets were partially achieved. So, and obviously a lot of yellow. So the yellow indicates that yes, there has been progress in a lot of components, but just not sufficient to meet the targets and the ambitions that were set at the beginning of the decade. So it's a sobering picture in terms of achievement. However, it's not all doom and gloom, and I hope I can show as we continue in this talk that there are important aspects of progress that we must recognize and build on in order to really step up progress in the coming years. So I'm going to take just a few examples that I think show both the positive and the negative, talking across these targets. So target 5, for example, which was the target to reduce the loss of habitats and particularly reducing the rate of deforestation. Well, from this chart, you can see that there is some positive news in the sense that the overall rate of deforestation has fallen globally by about 1/3 if you compare the last decade with the decade before. In other words, 2010 to 2020 compared to 2000 to 2010. And you can see that in different regions, there's been a combination of some expansion of forest and some loss of forest. And then the black line you can see is the net forest loss or gain. However, that target certainly has not been met according to to what was set in 2010. There are some signs that in some parts of the world, notably, for example, in the Brazilian Amazon, recently there, despite very significant progress in reducing deforestation in the previous years, that's starting to go on the rise again. And a notable finding of the latest information going into this report is that in the last 5 years of the decade, Africa actually overtook South America as the continent in which the rate of deforestation is highest. Moving to target 6, which was about moving towards more sustainable fisheries, again, there's some positive and negative. The positive part is that where good fisheries management has been introduced, where there are proper stock assessments, proper enforcement and regulation of fishing, which actually accounts for a growing number of fisheries, and it's estimated perhaps up to 50% of fisheries worldwide, there have been some significant positive real-world impact, where you can see that in those fisheries, the abundance of marine fish stocks has been maintained or rebuilt. So it's an example of showing that where policies and measures are brought in, you can see results in the real world, in the natural world. However, when you look at the overall picture of the sustainability of fishing, unfortunately, the proportion of overfished stocks, of ecologically unsustainable fishing stocks, is still increasing, and accounts for now over a third of all fish stocks worldwide. An area where there has been significant improvement, and you can see this reflected in two components that are green in this one, is target 11 over protected areas. And a couple of the key numeric targets in the Aichi biodiversity targets were that 17% of land area and 10% of marine area should be under formal protection by 2020. When you take account both what's been reported in the World Database on Protected Areas and current commitments, it's almost certain that both of those area-based targets will have been met. However, and this is a really important caveat, when you look at other parts of the indicator that look at the management effectiveness and the equitable management of protected areas, the extent to which protected areas are representative, ecologically representative, and are effectively connected to one another, the progress has been much more limited. And that's why this is a partial achievement and not a full achievement. Target 12, which deals with reducing extinction risk, again, there's good news and bad news. The positive news is that in a recent study which came out actually just before GBO5, it can be evaluated that in the absence of conservation measures, the number of extinctions and of birds and mammals just in the last decade is likely to have been between 2 and 4 times higher than the actual extinction rate. Now, we're talking about a relatively small number of species, and you can see them listed there, but it does make the point that where there are strong targeted conservation efforts, there is, again, a real world impact in terms of the reduction of extinction risk. However, if you look at it globally, species on average continue to move towards higher risk of extinction. Species populations will continue to decline. We'll hear much more about that in the next talk. And the so-called extinction debt continues to accumulate. In other words, if you like, the built-in extinctions that will happen if we carry on with business as usual. And then just one more target I'm going to highlight, is target 19 around the sharing of data and knowledge on biodiversity. There's positive outcomes there, the green there, in terms of really something of a revolution in the volumes of data that relating to the world species that have been mobilized and are shared and are universally available. Important and exciting technological advances in terms of modeling and artificial intelligence, which open up new opportunities to improve our ability to understand biodiversity in the biosphere. And I'll just give a little bit of a shout out to my own organization, Dziba. That chart on the right shows those very high volumes of records that through a global community effort are being shared and made available for the common good. However, even in this area, we know that there are still major imbalances in terms of the location and taxonomic focus of studies and monitoring. And very importantly, when you look at the extent to which such knowledge is being applied in decision-making, there's still a very long way to go. So that's a kind of a summary of the global picture. I'm just going to make one comment because this was an important conclusion and analysis in the report, that a big challenge has been that while we have these global targets that are designed to track progress and there are global indicators, we also have a huge amount of information coming in from national targets through the national reports I mentioned. The problem is that a large number of the targets set at national level do not align well with those global targets. So in other words, even though thematically you may have a national target which relates to a global target on invasive species or on reducing deforestation, very often those targets either aren't exactly aligned or they may be much less ambitious than the global target. So it's a complicated graph there, but if you pick out those colors that are shaded dark in each of those categories, it shows those targets which are well aligned to and closer to the ambition of the global targets. And so really what we'd be looking for is, as much as possible, dark green lines to show national achievement of targets that align with the global ambition. And what we find from that is that actually fewer than a quarter of national targets are well aligned in scope and ambition with the global targets, and only about 1 in 10 of national targets are both aligned, so similar to the IHE biodiversity targets, and are on track to be met. So I'm going to move now to the final section of the report, which looked into the future. And the big question there, and this will come up in all of these talks, is based on where we are and what we know, or what the science is telling us, is it still possible to so-called bend the curve of biodiversity loss? In other words, not just to prevent and slow the declines that we've been seeing to date, but actually to start turning that around and to restore lost biodiversity, which we have to do if we're going to reach our overall vision. This is this isn't a numerical chart. It's really a thematic representation to show the possibilities, accumulating the studies that are available, of what is still possible. And I guess, and the headline there is, if you like, yes, we can. Yes, it is still possible, but only with a radical combination of coordinated actions. And the important point to note here is that each of these is necessary. But if we were only to choose some of these areas of progress without doing them in combination, we would not get to where we want to be. And again, we'll hear more about this in the other talks, but essentially that combination consists of radically stepped up action on conservation and restoration, radically improved action on climate change, reduction of other drivers, including, for example, invasive alien species, pollution, overexploitation of marine and terrestrial biodiversity. And critically, these are areas which are elsewhere beyond, if you like, the direct biodiversity or indeed climate action areas, which is radical action to make both production and consumption, in particular of food, more sustainable. One study that was carried out in parallel with the assessment by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL, took a bit of a deeper look at one aspect of this, of the futures, which is understanding that radical conservation measures and those other components that I mentioned are necessary, that there are different choices, different pathways that can be selected in terms of the way in which conservation is approached. So broadly, this study looked at 2 scenarios. One was given the title of Half Earth, which was characterized by favoring strictly protected areas, protecting existing wilderness, and then a sustainable intensification of agriculture in areas outside protected areas. And the other one, which was called Sharing the Planet, was taking an approach which was more focused on maximizing the benefits from nature through supporting ecosystem services, in particular characterized by landscape level conservation. And what you'll see from that, if you contrast the 2 charts, is that while the so-called half Earth type of solutions has good impact, good results when you look particularly at terrestrial biodiversity, when you look at the nature's benefits to people, ecosystem services, it's that more mosaic sharing the earth approach which tends to have the more positive outcomes on the right. It's not to say that there are crude choices to take one approach or another, but I think it helps to emphasize that depending on the priorities that society makes, you can have quite contrasting and different outcomes, even assuming, first of all, greatly stepped up nature conservation, and also both of these scenarios assume very strong climate change mitigation. I'm just going to finish off with the final aspect of this forward-looking part of the report, which was termed Transitions for a Better Future. And this was looking at what are the fundamental changes that need to be made in terms of realigning people's relationship with nature and a move to sustainability across different areas. And you'll see that there are 8 named transitions here relating to land and forests, sustainable agriculture, critically cities and infrastructure, sustainable fresh water, climate, One Health, again with the current situation. The critical links between biodiversity and health are ever more at the forefront of our needs and thinking. And then sustainable food and fisheries and ocean. You'll see it's perhaps an obvious point through all the red arrows that each of these areas of transition are interlinked with most of the others. And then if you look at on the right where the wind farms are on that little hill, that makes the point that of the interplay and the interconnection between climate and pretty much all of these areas of transition. And then I'll just finish off by focusing in on that one transition, which is defined as the Sustainable Climate Action Transition. And this emphasizes, again, the absolutely essential link between employing nature-based solutions alongside a rapid phase out of fossil fuel use to reduce the scale and impacts of climate change, which in itself provides positive benefits for biodiversity and other sustainable development goals. And it also then recognizes the essential role of biodiversity in sustaining the capacity of the biosphere to mitigate climate change through carbon storage and sequestration, and indeed enables adaptation to climate change through resilient ecosystems. And then just going back to the point I made near the beginning, it also recognizes the need to avoid some unnecessary trade-offs if, for example, some solutions relating to renewable energy can potentially have a negative impact on biodiversity. So that's part of the challenge of tackling these issues together. And then on the right, this is just a representation of some of the key land-focused climate mitigation measures that would, according to a major study on which this is based, account for something like 30% of required mitigation by 2050. So I'll finish it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's great. We've stuck to the time. I really appreciate it. I've got a ton of questions, but I'm going to park it to the end. And just a reminder, everybody, if you've got questions as well, please write it in the chat group. And Neville has just asked if you can change your name to your actual name so that we know who to direct the question to at the end. So our second panelist is Dr. Nicola van Bredenkamp. Nicola is a colleague of mine, and she has a PhD from Stellenbosch University and has a broad interest in ecology and conservation. For the last 10 years, she's been employed as a global change scientist for South African national parks based in Cape Town. This position involves research with policy and management relevance in the field of global change. Her current focus is on climate change vulnerability assessments for species and national parks. Nicola, along with colleague Prof. Wendy Foden, contributed to the climate change focus report of the 2020 Living Planet report. So she's going to share some of the finding from the Living Planet report, and we'll also again tackle the questions at the end. Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks, Danny. Thanks, everyone. So I contributed a very small portion to this Living Planet report. And if you just look at the name, it sounds wonderful. But when you read the contents, it's like, yo, this is a misnomer. This is talking about a dying planet. So I'm going to just take you through some of the results and look at really how we can try and ensure that we remain on a living planet. There'll be some overlap with what Tim's told you, but I'll try and point this out as we go along. So to dive right in, this Living Planet Index tracks populations of around 21,000 different mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. So sorry for the plant people, it's only animals, all around the world. You can see here the new populations included for the first time are in this sort of brown-orange color. And the data span between 1970 and 2016. So it's just around 50 years. And then all of these data are used to track changes in average population size across all of these different populations to produce this Living Planet Index, which shows a decline, quite an alarming one, of around 68% over the last 50 years. So that's on average since 1970, we've lost about 2/3 of our population sizes. If we single out freshwater species, the decline is even more dramatic at 84%. And I'd just like to reiterate, this is not the proportion of populations that are declining. This is actually the magnitude of the decline. So if we look a little bit more into what that means, these graphs here represent the proportion of species and populations that have increasing population trends, declining population trends, or stable populations. And we can see that it's only amphibians where a large proportion, 60% of populations, are declining. But the key point is that for those species and populations where there's an increase, the increases have been small, but where populations have been declining, those declines have been so dramatic that the overall index is negative and reflects an average decline of almost 70%. So if we look at where these declines are taking place, you can see here regions like North America, Europe, Central Asia, even Asia Pacific, the declines don't look all that bad. Europe, Asia is sitting at around 24% down in the last 50 years. But this is really because these regions lost their biodiversity before 1970. What's really frightening is if we look at the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa, we see enormous declines. Latin America, for example, populations are on average down by 94% since 1970. And this is scary because those are our traditional harbors of biodiversity, and we're seeing them start to collapse in the same way that we saw other regions collapse historically. So if we look at what's driving these changes, here you can see these pie charts represent different drivers of change, and this purplish colors is land use change and habitat loss. And historically, this has been by far the most dominant driver of change. Up until now, climate change hasn't played a very big role, but we start seeing in places like the Americas between 12 and 14% of population declines are already directly attributable to climate change. And we know that in the coming years and decades, this is going to be a much greater threat, and that none of those other threats are going away. So this paints a pretty bleak picture. Not included, I've mentioned we haven't included the plants in this assessment, but we do know from other work that extinction rates in plants are up to 500 times faster than they were in pre-industrial times. We also haven't looked at soil fauna and invertebrates. We know that terrestrially, for both plants and animals, almost 90% of species use soil at some point in their lifespan. So it's a critically important component that's poorly understood and something that we'd really need to look into given the amount of soil destruction that we've been doing over the last few decades. Lastly, the invertebrates were not included, although there are very good data from Europe on butterflies. And the butterfly index over the last 20 years has showed on average a 50% decline. Across all of these groups, while there's some indication that some populations are increasing, these tend to be your more common and generalist species, and there's a universal trend that your specialist species seem to be disappearing everywhere. Right, so aside from sitting in lockdown at home, what did our world look like in 2020? How did we get ourselves into this predicament? Well, if we look at the people, we see that over the last 50 years, except for the least developed countries, there's been a massive increase in gross domestic product per person. At the same time, we're seeing increased consumption in more developed countries, which is driving extraction of living materials from nature. And that material normally comes from other countries, so the least developed countries. We are also seeing that there has been, as Tim pointed out, an increase in protected areas, but most of that increase is taking place in developed countries where we saw from the previous graphs, we've already lost a significant portion of our biodiversity. At the same time, human populations are increasing, they're becoming more urbanized, and this is setting us up for disaster because it's very unequal, and unequal means unstable. So one of the biggest problems, as Tim pointed out, of population growth is feeding such a large population. And because this report is all about numbers, I'd like to just bring to your attention some of the numbers that accompany food production. Food production is directly responsible for 80% of global deforestation, 70% of global freshwater use, and it generates about a third of our global greenhouse gas emissions annually. So 70% of terrestrial biodiversity loss and 50% of freshwater biodiversity loss are directly attributable to food production. And the scary thing is that we've already got 52% of our agricultural land sitting in a degraded state. And if this is not bad enough, we waste a lot of the food that we produce. So on average, globally, almost 15% of food is wasted. And I found this particular stat really interesting, that food loss is responsible globally for about 6% of our total greenhouse gas emissions, which is shockingly 3 times greater than the global emissions from aviation. This next graph really brought home some important messages to me on how we're currently overspending our Earth's budget. We're currently overshooting what the Earth can sustainably provide us with by about 1.5 times. And the largest contributor to this overshoot by far is our carbon footprint. So things like deforestation, overharvesting, fishing, all the rest, they do play a role. But extraction and use of fossil fuels is the thing that we really, really need to stop. And what's been interesting about the global shutdown during the coronavirus pandemic was that all of that savings in carbon more or less equates to what we'd need to do year on year to meet the Paris Agreement. And clearly just stopping is not a sustainable solution. So there needs to be a rapid and systemic change to the way that we live if we want to bring ourselves back under this curve. Right, so where do we start in trying to fix this? The good news is we've still got about 25% of the terrestrial land left in a wilderness condition. Map looks wonderful, there's green everywhere, but just take a look. It's the outback, it's the Sahara Desert, it's ice desert, and an increasingly fragmented Amazon rainforest. So we don't have a lot of green space left in wilderness condition, and the situation in the oceans is even worse. We've only got about 13% of oceans left in a wilderness condition. Right, so to summarize this bleak picture before we start looking at the solutions, we've got 75% of the Earth's ice-free land being significantly altered. We've lost 85% of our wetlands. Our wildlife populations are down 2/3 since 1970, freshwater populations even worse. We know that nearly all of our terrestrial organisms spend a part of their life cycle in the soil. We also know that we are destroying and causing soil erosion at rates up to 100 times faster than soil is forming. And we have this new threat, climate change, that is threatening up to 20% of wild species by the end of the century. So that's a completely new thing that we've added to all of the destruction that we've already seen. At the same time, we've had a doubling of the human population, a 4-fold increase in the global economy, a 10-fold increase in trade, and a 1,200-fold increase in imports to developed countries. But yet, 1 in 4 people do not have regular access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So sure, that's a rather bleak situation. However, the Living Planet realized that we can't paint such a bleak picture without looking at the options. Tim has already presented a few of these, but chapter 4 and the Nature paper that accompanied it looked at how we bend this curve of biodiversity loss. So I'll go into a bit more of the details of the modeling. The authors used the IPCC's middle of the road scenario, which is kind of business as usual with limited efforts towards conservation and sustainable production as the base scenario. And then they played around and they said, okay, what happens if we increase crop yield without needing more land? We make our crops do better and we increase trade so that there are fewer trade barriers and stuff gets where it needs to be. Then they looked at what happens if we change the demand side of things, we reduce agricultural waste, and we shift our diets to a lower share of animal calories. Then the final set of actions looked at increasing conservation. So that's kind of similar to that half Earth kind of set of actions where we maximize protected areas. And then they looked at these things in combination, supply and conservation, demand and conservation, and then the integrated action portfolio that Tim was talking about. So the results are a little bit complicated, but I'll try and break them down for you. You'll see that each scenario produces a very broad range of outcomes. And the reason for this is that each scenario used 4 different models of land use change that predict what land use is going to look like by the end of the century. But the clear point that I want to show you here is that only this integrated portfolio scenario gets us to bend that curve to a better picture by the end of the century than where we are now. If we look at this further at how this curve bends, one of the key statistics is peak loss. Peak loss has 2 components. The first is the year in which we start bending the curve, so we stop seeing loss and we start seeing gains. And the second is the amount of biodiversity that has been lost by that point. So you can see if we immediately implement this entire portfolio, we will bend the curve of biodiversity loss before the end of this decade, and we won't lose that much more. If we had to implement conservation actions only, we'd bend the curve by 2050, but we'd lose significantly more biodiversity before then. So one clearly needs to do all of these actions together. It's been mentioned before, but I just want to talk about it's not just the fact that the coordinated framework does so much better. It has large co-benefits. It reduces greenhouse gas emissions, it reduces unsustainable practices, water consumption, health, it improves health benefits. And the biggest thing it does is it reduces the trade-off that you would have if you had the conservation only scenario. You've got a massive trade-off between conservation and agriculture. So just to delve more into what each individual scenario does, the conservation scenario is the one that brings the biodiversity loss to a halt fastest. It also prevents the greatest amount of damage and does it at the fastest rate. Only addressing supply issues performs the worst in terms of these targets, whereas the demand side does somewhere in between. But very clearly, one has to integrate all three if you want to see some success. So the good message is that, as Tim pointed out, we can do this. The authors have demonstrated that this is possible. Not to be a dampener, but they also concluded that we should show that with immediate efforts consistent with broader sustainability agenda, but of unprecedented ambition and coordination, we could enable provision of food for a growing human population while reversing biodiversity loss. So there's a lot of ifs in that statement, but I really think we need to focus on the fact that it is still possible to do this. So one more set of doom and gloom before we move on to some more solutions is the fact that that particular set of models that I showed you does not incorporate what happens under climate change. It does not incorporate the impacts of invasive alien species, and it's not looking at what's going on in the marine environment. So to counter some of this and bring some more perspective, the Living Planet report actually produced a whole supplement that looks at what is happening in terms of climate change. And the good thing is that all of the actions towards biodiversity, as Tim said, also promote climate change mitigation. So to look into climate change, the first real example that we had of an impact of climate change on biodiversity was in the 1990s, where Camille Parmesan noticed some interesting changes in the distribution of butterflies that were best explained by the butterflies tracking cooler altitudes or upslope climates. And just 20 years later, we've got examples everywhere. The latest paper shows that 82% of biological processes already have documented impacts of climate change, from genetic processes to physiology, morphology, you name it. So where we had to really look closely 20 years ago, the examples are now everywhere. So just to show you one or two examples from the report that came out, these are the Australian flying foxes. I'm sure you may have heard of them in the media with regards to climate change. But what makes them really useful as an example is that they have these mass roosts. So tens of thousands of animals will roost in the same place. And that makes it really easy to observe impacts at a population level. You can go out in a heat wave and look at what is happening to an entire population at one time. So while these guys don't do all that well under hot heat conditions, they do have some things that they can do. And the way that they cool themselves down is to lick themselves for evaporative cooling or to pant. But unfortunately, both of these actions come with high evaporative water loss, and so they are very costly. And the result is that they are physiologically incapable of tolerating temperatures above 42 degrees. And what happens at these temperatures is they become quite frenzied, trying to cool down, and they start dropping from their trees literally in the tens of thousands. And unseasonal heat waves are particularly problematic if you've got lots of lactating females and young. So this is maybe an extreme example, but I think it's a frightening reminder and also a harsh wake-up call for us to think this one we can see easily, but what's happening to everything in the soil? What's happening in the places where we never look, to those small solitary species? So I think it is a really useful example. Another example came in 2016, where we had our first mammal extinction as a direct result of climate change. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the details of this extinction, But one of the graphs that came out alongside the extinction, I really like, not that one likes extinction, but they put up a graph and they said, if you've got a number of individuals and you are losing individuals over time, clearly the time to try and stop that trend is kind of before you've hit the end point. And yeah, so we need to act now. And that graph looks an awful lot like the Living Planet Index. And what more warning do we need? The time to do something to reverse this trend is clearly now. So what do we do? And, you know, reading from the report and also my own views, I think we have two roles. The one is our role as global citizens, and the other one is as people working in a conservation-related field. And these things are linked by our actions and the stories that we tell. And the key lies in changing the narrative. The loss of nature is a material risk for economies and well-being. And we need to accept that protecting and enhancing our environment has to be at the heart of how we achieve economic prosperity. So the current corona crisis, I mean, it's a disaster, and it requires that we rebuild everywhere. But we need to rebuild with sustainability at the core. We need to be rebuilding in a completely different way. So this Living Planet report was also accompanied by a supplement, Voices for the Living Planet. And there's some really great stuff in there. I'd encourage all of you to go and read a little bit to enhance your thinking. There's just a few quotes I'd like to draw out. This one by Mathis Wachenagel says, environmental issues are a sideshow, something for corporate social investment to look good. And he says such postulations fuel the belief that responding to climate change is an added cost. They make climate action benevolent, noble, voluntary, and therefore it doesn't really exist. And this spreads this belief that we need to wait for some elusive, and he says, frankly, unlikely global collaboration before we can act. Another one of the authors, Ingrid Rebains, points out that history shows that individuals do have the power to bring change. Cass Sunstein just simplifies this all the way down to says, green should be automatic, the default. We shouldn't have to ask and pay R1,000 extra to get something green. We need to live in a world where green is the default. So right, you might ask, if green is the default, we need to stop plastic, save the planet, solve inequality, join the climate strike, pay for someone's education, walk to work. It's too much. We can't do all of that. But there are 8 billion of us. So I would like to challenge you to pick one cause that you're passionate about, do your research, and start thinking about it in a completely new way. Because if 8 billion of us have that kind of innovation, we will see change and we will be able to reverse this trend. We have shown that there's a way, we just need the will. And if you have no idea where to start, we can always rely on the best environmental storyteller of our time, Sir David Attenborough. He's got a beautiful new movie that I encourage all of you to watch, which is filled with some really great ideas for solutions to these problems. Not all of them are without their trade-offs. Some of the examples rely a lot on technology and clear trade-offs with more conservation-oriented solutions. And if we think in South Africa, for example, we've got a basket full of social and environmental problems and economic problems. But if one thinks purely from a conservation perspective, one of the things that's really come out this year is that if we've got to set up 40% of the earth being protected as our goal, then we're going to need an alternate model for funding conservation, because tourism was always risky and it really fell apart this year as a source of funding. And I think that's something really important that we need to think about. And at the same time, while all this big worldly debate is going on, I think we often lose sight and we think, what's the point of doing what we're doing? And some may argue that there's little point in trying to save species from immediate threats if their long-term survival is in question. But Guy Mitchell once said to me, look, at some point, it's going to get that bad that we have to do something. So whether by choice now or by force in a few years' time, we will change our ways. And at that point, we want there to be something left to save. So that means seed banks or a zoo or your garden or your tiny little reserve, then so be it. Keep up your good biodiversity work. Now, I'd just like to end quickly with this slide that I borrowed from Wendy Foden on the ideas of Joanna Macy and Chris Johnson. And they propose 3 stories to tell about our future. There's the business as usual story of industrial growth with bigger and better every year. There's the great unraveling, which is the story told by people like us, scientists, journalists, activists, saying, whoa, everything is going downhill. But there's a third alternative. They dub it the great turning, and it's telling a story of transition from industrial growth to a life-sustaining society. And I think we need to believe in the story and just keep telling it until we believe in it. Because where there's a will, we will find the way to bend that biodiversity curve. So I'd just like to thank you and say we have the time now not to get back to business as usual as it was in 2019, but to change to something better than we had before, to keep up our good work and tell the new story. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you so much, Nicola. So, and we definitely need to pick a cause because it's lots of food for thought, lots of things we need to actually be doing, but it is overwhelming. So to break it up into things that you can do each day is definitely important. So I'd like to, we're running a little bit over time, but I don't think that's a problem. We plan to go till about 5:30. I see questions are coming in, so we should be good in terms of time. I then would like to hand us over to Luthando Dziba. Dr. Luthando Dziba is our third speaker for today. He holds a PhD from Utah State University. He is a managing executive for conservation services at South African National Parks. He's joined SAN Parks following a 7-year stint at the CSIR, where he managed the ecosystem services research area, which led cutting-edge research on biodiversity and ecosystem services, coastal systems, as well as Earth observation. Luthando has a strong interest in mainstreaming ecosystem service science into development, planning, and policy, and as a result has played a major role in the international forums and platforms such as the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where he serves as a co-chair of its multidisciplinary expert panel. So Luthando is going to talk to us about the IPBES assessments, which Tim mentioned had come out in April of 2019. Thank you, Luthando.
Thank you very much, Danny, and good afternoon to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. I appreciated the conversations that both Tim and Nicola have led before, and I think, I mean, if I were to be very short, I would have just said I completely agree with them, and then we take questions. But I had agreed to give a short presentation, just reflecting on some of the key findings of the IPBES assessments and their contribution as well to decision making, particularly for people in nature. And so that is what I will do briefly. I will start by just briefly reflecting on the history of IPBES. I'm trying to move my slides here. Okay, yeah. On the history of IPBES and reflect on the on its key functions. IPBES was established formally in 2012. It is an independent science policy platform. It is hosted by a number of UN agencies, but has membership currently from about 126 governments, and includes partnerships or participation by indigenous and local peoples, UN organizations, intergovernmental conventions, the scientific community, NGOs, and business and industry. IPBES has 4 key functions, which include assessments, policy support, building capacity and knowledge, as well as communication and outreach on science and policy relevant matters. It has produced a number of assessment reports, and the global assessment, which I will focus on, is just one of them. I do need to mention that IPBES joins a community, an established community of multilateral environmental agreements, and having been just established in 2012, it is one of the youngest, from a long history of various agreements that have been established. What was the focus of the IPBES global assessment? I do want to say that, I mean, most of the findings that have been shared by Tim, as well as by Nicola, basically are quite aligned, and in some cases, derive from the work that was done by experts from all over the world in this report, which was published in 2019. The focus or the scope of the report was to look at the status and trends in nature and in direct and indirect drivers of change, It also looked at how does nature contribute to the global achievement, to the achievement of global goals, including sustainable development goals. What are the plausible futures for nature and for good quality of life between now and 2050? And what are the pathways and policy interventions scenarios that can lead to sustainable futures? And what are the opportunities and challenges as well as options available to decision makers relating to nature and its contributions to good quality of life? The findings that I'm going to share I'm not going to cover this scope quite comprehensively, but I thought I'd pick up a few so that we can see what were some of the key themes emerging from that report. And I think the overall finding really was that life on Earth is deteriorating fast, and this is happening worldwide. Virtually all indicators of the global state of nature are decreasing, whether you're looking at biomes or ecosystems or species, up to different breeds. And I think one of the key findings, or some of the key findings include the fact that 75% of the terrestrial environment has been severely altered to date by human actions. And this is about 66% of the marine environment. 15% increase in global per capita consumption of materials since 1980. And so one of the things that Nicola mentioned, which I think also came out from this global assessment, was that as our consumption increase, per capita consumption, we have also seen that our impact on the environment has also increased. And the impacts on wetlands since 1700 has been quite substantial. 85% of wetlands have been lost by 2000 since 1700. And the loss of wetlands currently is 3 times faster in percentage terms compared to forest loss. Again, when it comes to species level or populations of varieties of plants and animals, we are seeing substantial impacts that there's a total of 8 million estimated animal and plant species on Earth, but up to 1 million of these are threatened with extinction, and many of those within decades. So a significant proportion of what we have is already threatened with extinction, and 25% is the average proportion of species that are threatened with extinction across terrestrial, freshwater, marine, and invertebrate and plant groups. So basically, if you look across the board, about a quarter of the species that exist on Earth today are basically threatened. And if you are looking at average abundance of native species in most major terrestrial biomes, you're looking at a decline of about 20% since 1900. And if you look across, basically, this is across different taxa, whether you're talking about cycads, amphibians, or you're looking at mammals or birds, across species, we are seeing a number of species that are in the category of threatened, meaning vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And this has accelerated since the 1900s. And this is something that I think is very important to note, that we are living in a time of accelerated extinctions, and we're living in a time where our impacts are directly having an effect on the existence of other species. Food and agriculture came up as strongly as one of the key drivers of some of these impacts. And basically, we have seen a 300% increase in food production, particularly crop production, since 1970. 23% of the land areas that have seen a reduction in productivity due to land degradation. So we have increased food production, but we have been continuing to degrade land, leading to loss in productivity. And so what that means is that increasingly over time, we basically continue to use more land in order to feed, the human population. 75% of global food types rely on pollination, and yet the impacts that we have on pollinators are quite significant, and therefore threatening food production. So some of these impacts, have, really I don't know how to put it. We're doing things that negatively impact even our ability to feed and sustain, ourselves, and in ways that basically eventually compromise, the efficiency with which we produce food, with which, we sustain human life here on Earth. And if you look at, the number of the world's land surface and also freshwater resources that we are devoting to crop or livestock production, is we devote about 33% of the land surface to crop and livestock production, and 75% of our water resources, freshwater resources, are devoted to food production. And yet 11% of the world population still remains undernourished. So what we see is that, if you look at this, this figure by Rockstrom, basically in the last century, what we have seen is a significant increase, particularly from around, the 1960s to the 2000s, of our abstraction of water. And a significant proportion of that water goes to food production, and hence the significant increase in food production that has been observed in the recent past. So we have dramatically reconfigured the fabric of life on the planet, but at the same time, the world, is becoming much more, interconnected, but increasingly unequal. So we're having a few people that have got access to, basically everything they want, and a growing number of people that, have got, shortages, are undernourished, and regions of the world where poverty is actually on the increase. And so one of the things that we see, like particularly when we are looking at solutions, is what are some of the drivers that are behind some of the increases. And I think it's important to see that directly, whether we're talking about terrestrial, freshwater, or marine ecosystems, land use or sea use, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive alien species come out as key drivers of change. So it's basically our activity or our actions on Earth that are actually impacting quite significantly on all of these systems. But what we see is that those direct drivers are underpinned by indirect drivers of change, which are much more dependent or influenced by social values, demographic and social cultural changes, such as, increase in our, population, significant increases in population. For instance, the continent of Africa, the population is expected to double by 2050. And with that, we're seeing as well significant increases in consumption, per capita consumption, economic and technological changes, the poor or dysfunctional institutions and decline in governance, as well as conflicts and epidemics, are some of the things that are fueling some of these more direct drivers that we are seeing. And so when we come closer to the African continent, what we saw, particularly I'm now reflecting on the findings of the Africa assessment, which was published in 2018, was that Africa is extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Some 20% of the continent, which basically represents about 600 million hectares, is estimated to be degraded because of soil erosion, salinization, pollution, and loss of vegetation or soil fertility. Africa is also significantly vulnerable to climate change, which is projected to drive significant losses in species, especially birds and mammals, as well as a decline in the productivity of Africa's lakes and significant loss of other species on the continent. Nicola reflected on the declines in populations globally, and on the continent, Africa has seen a 59% decline in mammal populations from 1970 to 2005, and significant declines in the various subregions across the continent. But key thing is that overexploitation and land use again are some of the major drivers of that change. And these changes are seen across, different species, whether we're talking about, plants, you're talking about large mammals like rhino, like we're now seeing in the marine environment, significant declines in the African penguin population that are driven, in part by our own use of, these resources. What I think is important, though, to note for Africa, and this is something that I think, is still a positive thing to remember when even consider our, options for action right now. Africa remains, one of the few continents in the world with a relatively intact assemblage of its mega herbivores. The animals above the line in black are animals that have basically gone extinct in each of the different continents. And if you look at Eurasia, Australasia, North America, South America, seeing significant populations or significant numbers of species of mega herbivores that have really gone extinct. But in Africa, the majority of species, especially large mammals, are still, they're in existence, even though the populations are, in some cases, significantly in decline. And I think, if there is opportunity for action, it is now. And I think we have something to work with compared to other continents. And I think that is something worth remembering. So if you look then at the options for actions that have been presented, particularly within the context of the discussions for preparation for the post-2020 global biodiversity agenda, we see that these reports that we are talking about, including the IPBES Global Assessment Report, the Living Planet Report, and the GBO report, which showed all together, that land use, climate change, pollution, overexploitation, and invasive species, are some of the key drivers of the loss of biodiversity and really declines that we are seeing that are obviously a major reason for concern. And if you couple that with the needs for people for sustainable use, for access to fresh water, food, and health, and also for ensuring equitable sharing of benefits, that there is an opportunity to work towards living in harmony with nature. And I think both Nicola and team spent a significant amount of time demonstrating the options that are there in bending the curve of biodiversity loss and ensuring that in an integrated fashion, that if we act now and act together and that some of these transformative changes can actually lead to achieving a vision of living in harmony with nature. So where we're not just pursuing human interest, but we realize the dependence of human life on basically a sustainable and thriving planet. And so if we come even closer, we are a protected area agency at South African national parks, and we're looking at how can we true sustainable conservation measures contribute to effective management of protected areas, protected area expansion, management effectiveness, particularly in aquatic systems that are under our management, climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as restoration of degraded systems, and improving population management, particularly for species that are coming under major attack, such as rhino. On the other hand, I mean, the funding model for conservation in South Africa has always been, nature-based tourism, where we've seen, like, SANParks at its peak, bringing significant revenue from tourism, well in excess of 2 billion rands, with, millions of visitors to our national park and coming in and staying overnight, in our facilities. But with COVID, that has, changed significantly. And really, we don't know, what the world post-COVID looks like. And as an agency that significantly depends on tourism revenue for managing the protected area estate, this is a major threat for us. It is public knowledge that SANParks receives about 20% of its budget from government, and the other 80% is self-generated. But without visitors to our national parks, that picture basically becomes quite dire in terms of our ability to be able to protect or manage the protected area estate, which was one of the key achievements in the last set of Aichi targets, the declaration and management effectiveness of protected areas was one of the, I guess, positives that emerged from that last decade for biodiversity. So now, the current situation puts into question what will happen, to biodiversity conservation efforts going forward, particularly in light of losses in revenue and tightening of fiscal resources for actually investing in many of these issues that we are talking about today. I will not spend time, but I wanted to just highlight that IPBES has also recently produced a report on biodiversity and pandemics, which was an outcome of a workshop that was organized in response to the outbreak of COVID-19, and IPBES is also working on a report, which is an outcome of a workshop held in December on biodiversity and climate change. And so I think there's a lot of activity, but also there's a recognition that biodiversity is not an isolated domain, but that it is quite interlinked with others, and I think the need to work together, is quite clear across the board when you look at, some of the issues that, we are dealing with in the biodiversity sector. And I think within the context of these conversations on climate, there are overlaps, and I think there is a recognition that biodiversity and climate change are quite interlinked. With that, I think I will skip this slide, which really refers to broader actions at policy level, and I think that the work that we are working on towards the post-2020 agenda, this year, subsumes a number of the issues that we're looking at the national and local level. With that, I will stop there, Danny, and thank you very much for the time.
Thanks so much, Luthando. Really appreciate you also, driving a little bit of a local sort of what we as SANParks consider important and what are we doing at a very local scale. So everybody, thank you so much for contributing in the chat. The chat's been super active. People have been commenting and sharing articles, so please check that out. And what Neville will do is when he shares the video, he'll also share the chat so that you guys can also get some of the links, which I think will be super useful. We have actually running a little bit over. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm going to sort of pick and choose a few of the questions that we'll handle first up. But for those of you that want to log off, you have time commitments at past. You're more than welcome to. For those that want to stay on a little bit, I think if we can just ask for 15 minutes more till 5:45, that'd be great. Just to cover some of the questions. There's a lot of repetition, so I'll try to sort of break it up into a few themes and pose it to the speakers. So I'll start with Tim. Tim, from Louise Swimmer, she was interested in the lack of alignment that you mentioned between global and national targets. And she's wondering if you could perhaps share some insights into why this might be.
Yes, I guess it's a bit sensitive because I'm not here to speak on behalf of the CBD, and there's some fairly deep questions, I think, that are discussed and have been discussed through the CBD on this question. I think it's really it's a factor of the way in which the requirements of reporting to the CBD have or have not been, if you like, mandated to be fully aligned to meet some very specific connections with what's set globally, and I guess you could maybe contrast it somewhat with the climate situation, and I'm not a great expert on that, but my understanding is that the requirements for reporting under the Climate Convention are really very, very strictly and clearly mandated, and there are accepted and required methodologies for reporting emissions, for example, that make the national reporting and the targets fairly straightforward to then aggregate and extrapolate to the global level. Now, and that hasn't happened to nearly the same extent with regard to the CBD and national reporting. I think part of that is just because of the nature of biodiversity. It's not always a straightforward thing to take a global target and global indicators and have a very obvious way to translate that into international targets. And it's partly, I think, just the dynamics of the convention itself, where there has been, I think, a certain reluctance to be absolutely prescriptive to individual parties about the way in which they are reporting. There's been some standardization, for example, in the way that the national reports have been designed in terms of meeting templates to report on specific actions. But even there, and I've kind of seen this from the at the coalface, as it were, by looking and trying to make comparisons between national reports and finding it's extremely difficult just because of the often the fairly non-standard way in which that reporting is done, despite, there certainly have been efforts to make it more standard. So I think there isn't a simple answer, and it's something that I know the CBD are very aware of, and certainly in the next round now of discussions of the framework that is to replace the Aichi target, still under negotiation, and which will be decided at the next COP meeting later this year in China, is to learn those lessons and see ways in which you can have global targets that, first of all, themselves are smart and measurable, but that also then can be translated and clearly conveyed to countries in terms of designing targets and indicators that are better aligned to the global picture.
Perfect. I think there's been a few follow-ups from various people regarding this misalignment of these global reporting targets and local scale reporting, and so I think even what was his? Let me just quickly look. James Ayuk talks about that the picture is clear and easy comprehensible. I would say we're making these appeals to ourselves, so sort of preaching to the converted. Shouldn't we focus on how to translate these messages to managers of these resources and economies? And I think it speaks a little bit to this misalignment in that the environmental sector is the one that that is reporting on these targets. But it's these other sort of local aspects of local government and aspects of these other sectors in various government departments that also need to sort of make it part of their targets and mandate. And so there needs to be a process by which we're communicating beyond just the biodiversity and conservation community. I think we'll get back to Tim, but I think let's get a couple for Nicola. So Nicola, we've had a few on Romain Karan. He talks about, in terms of food and poverty, I'd love to know, how does agriculture contribute to this global biodiversity loss, and how we as individuals decrease the problem at hand and increase food production for direct human consumption. So he says, instead of feeding the animals and planting all these crops, clearing all natural vegetation for food, for animal production, should we not be directly consuming all of this crop?
So yes, that is a good suggestion, and one of the suggestions that has been made, and in fact that was one of the scenarios that was tested. So the demand side scenario did look at what happens if we decrease our portion of animal calories, but I think they showed that alone was not enough. And I've seen on the chat there's been quite a lot about how do we change the status quo, and Nadia was talking now about it always being conservation against development. And I think what the world is really missing is that it's not one or the other. It has to be both at the same time. We cannot have a world where it's only developed, and we cannot have a world where it's only conservation. It always has to be both. And I think with the climate change, we see things like in Europe, it's becoming kind of socially unacceptable to do multiple overseas trips every year because of your carbon footprint. And I think we need to move to a point where the same happens with our food. It should be completely socially unacceptable to buy food that contains palm oil that was generated through forest destruction, because forest destruction, like once it's destroyed, putting it back is almost impossible. And the same goes for many other ecosystems. There's got to be incentive out there to rather try and restore degraded land, or make use of what you've got, increase your technology or some other option. But there should be massive disincentive internationally against poor countries being allowed to sell pristine land, or I don't know. I mean, it's a massive international problem, and I don't know the politics of how it works, but I think the thing is to incentivize consumers to know what they're actually consuming and where it comes from, and to disincentivize rich countries from exploiting poor countries. If that kind of answers the question.
Thanks. I think I'd also like to sort of get Luthando's view on it, because I think this was also a highly contested issue in the IPBES report. And is it that this is what the more wealthier countries are suggesting to, and that all the change is actually then expected for the low-income countries?
Thanks, Danny. I think, the key thing is that what I think eventually is important is that for change that is needed, the change that is needed has to be transformative. It has to also be collective action. I think Nicola illustrated it well when she was talking about 7+ billion of us on Earth, and each one having to do their part. I think there is significant opportunity for developed countries to actually do more to cut their consumption and also to change their consumption patterns. But also there's opportunity for developing countries to actually pursue development pathways that are more sustainable and not necessarily follow the similar, destructive pathways to development that we have seen have had a negative impact on on the state of the environment, and which we see as well as not necessarily sustainable. I think it is important to also chat about alternative measures. I think in the chat there are some people that have spoken as well about the pursuit of GDP growth, as a single way of thinking about economic development. And I think, if you look at previous reports in Africa, we have in particular advocated for opportunities for looking at ways to balance, development objectives with, ensuring, more or by pursuing more sustainable options rather than, overexploitation, as well as, excessive, land use change that achieves in the short term some gains, but in the longer term compromises our ability to even feed or sustain ourselves.
Thanks so much. So we've got another question from Smarter Annika. Having acknowledged that climate change poses a prolific threat to economic activities, how can we mitigate these challenges? Any plan on the ground? So, and linked with that, I'm going to open it up to anybody, maybe Nicola, linked to that is, if we're talking about that clean energy is the way and weaning ourselves from a dependence on fossil fuels is one of the sort of scenarios to reversing the trend. Is there the political will to change, especially in the developing countries? I mean, I know India had major issues with this whole move to a development future that is green energy based because it's more costly. So who pays for it, especially in the developing world where they don't have energy infrastructure at the moment, and putting in place green energy infrastructure is still expensive or more expensive. So I don't know, Tim, do you want to start and then we can do Nicola as well?
Yes. Maybe I'll come over as a bit of the optimist in this argument, in the sense that I think, while all of our reports are showing things going absolutely in the wrong direction, I have a real sense, and maybe it's just the perspective of where I'm sitting, that there are real opportunities now for a major change in global perspectives on all of these issues, partly stimulated by the current COVID disaster, as Nicola mentioned, but taken together, if I could possibly mention a certain change of administration on the other side of the Atlantic that might have some influence as well. But that comes on top of, I think, at least a discourse and discussion among a large part of the population, both the general public, business, government, that is really seeing these issues now not as something on the fringe of decision making and public discourse, but absolutely at the center and as a matter of human survival. And as I say, having an existential human crisis in front of us inevitably, I think, puts that maybe increases that sense. But when you look at the governments that are starting to commit to net zero policies, just as an example, and really, I think, starting to make the connections which have been very much missing until very recently between nature and economic activity and climate and survival, that I'm seeing this, as I say, it might just be some distortion I'm getting from where I'm sitting and what I'm reading, but I do get a sense that the sort of transformations that are discussed in a somewhat abstract way, perhaps in our reports, to me are becoming a little bit more realistic and mainstream, just in the way that people are seeing the connection between their diets, their habits, what they see in terms of nature coming back when economic activity closes down, the importance of the essential importance of green spaces to maintain mental and physical health in a COVID lockdown. All of these things coming together, to me, actually gives some grounds for believing that there is a a real prospect for transformative change. But maybe that's just my naive optimism.
We love optimism. Nicola's told us the planet is dying, so we love optimism. Nicola, what are some of the sort of local scale things we can do about it?
Yeah, so I mean, you were asking about funding, and I mean, given our current situation, I mean, there's no money in the world. So I don't know what the answer is, but people are inventive. And I think from crisis, we have to hope that, some kind of ingenuity is going to come about. And I think that's why it's critically important to spread these messages to everybody now in this time of where we need to reinvent, because I heard a really good example that I'm stealing from someone else, and I can't remember her name, but she said, an engineer will build a bridge, and they'll build in safety and security and say, this is rated for a truck that's this heavy, but they'll make the truck lighter to make sure that nothing that crosses that bridge will come into disaster. We say, there's probably 80% chance that everything is going to go boom in the next 10 decades, but it's only 80%. We're not quite sure. There's a lot of variation in our models. So that's the worst case scenario. The engineer puts the worst case scenario and then takes action based on the fact that the worst case scenario is going to happen. And we're not doing that at all. We just kind of like hope that it'll go away. And I think that's the message that we need to get out there. It's not going away, and we really have to do things differently. And like I said, I really loved Isaac's example in the chat of taking kids to look at the sewage works, to look at where our waste goes, to really understand what it means to be a modern society and the mess that we're making. And if I just look at my own kids, they're really teachable. And my son's forever coming up with ideas. He's going to catch the wind as the car drives, and it's going to power his motor, and he's only 6. So you have to believe that if we tell people we need a new way, that they'll figure one out. And I can't speak to the global solutions, but I know there are lots of countries that have figured this out long ago and are doing it already. So, yeah.
Nicola. Luthando, I've got a few on, sort of local government, and Karina Singh, actually, she's from local government, and she asks, so all these documents are global scenarios and studies, but are there perhaps documents and studies we can use at a local level to scale down the impacts, so as to use these to develop local policies and programs for each municipality or city? Sam Ferreira also says, that this is, these global patterns are both, informative and concerning, and the global scale in which this is getting sort of noticed is heartening, but what is challenging is that action needs to happen at a local scale as well. And so how do we incentivize and facilitate action at these very local scales, and at multiple local scales, so that it actually then scales up into something significant? Luthando, knowing the sort of South African scenario and local municipalities and provinces, how do we get these messages into local development plans?
Good questions. Thanks, Danny. I think, first of all, if you look at the IPBES reports, and also Living Planet and even the GBO5 report, they obviously done at a global scale. But one of the things that we see is that member states, actually countries, including South Africa, and what we would like to see is that some of these reports could catalyze, or could inspire governments to actually do work at a local level, particularly because you do need to scale down to a local level in order to understand really what are some of the issues in South Africa and in different parts of the country, and be able to then develop plans that are informed by these findings at a local national level. But I think the patterns in by and large are quite similar in many respects, but I don't think you can understand them as well if they're just pitched at a global level. When it comes to to the biodiversity sector. And I think when we do the national biodiversity assessments, periodically, but I think, that is focused, it's quite sectoral. And I think that we do need to be doing assessments that are cross-sectoral and doing assessments that involved multiple, sectors, including, the food, energy, water, health, viewed, together with impacts of climate change and impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. So those need to be done at a national level, and for us to be able to understand those impacts. One of the things, and I think I'm picking up on a conversation that has been happening in the chat box, which is saying we're preaching to ourselves and talking to ourselves. I was quite fascinated when we were in Egypt for the CBD COP, I think 2 years ago, and in that meeting we had a Minister for Public Works, and I think I can't remember which other minister from South Africa who joined the meeting and were actually deliberately invited to lead sessions that were looking at mainstreaming biodiversity into sectors, manufacturing or energy or transport. And when we were sitting and reflecting at those end of day sessions, we were fascinated by the grasp that they and lessons that they had learned about the value, for instance, of nature, for instance, infrastructure development, where you develop infrastructure, how you develop infrastructure, how you manage infrastructure. And I think that these are things that unfortunately we are not consistent, because we do that one engagement, and then we say we would like to come back when we are back in South Africa, and even when we are here, we are not talking a lot across sectors, enough to be able to influence collective action, towards the kind of, desired outcome we want. And I think that these are things that we need to be speaking across sectors. We need to be, moving things from a global level to a national and local scale. We need to be consistent, and persistent in engaging, across, sectors, and create, opportunities for technical experts to be able to develop, planning documents collectively rather than doing it per sector, because that is basically what is happening. We plan in conservation, we plan in water, we plan in transport, in energy, and these are not at all in many cases speaking to each other. And I think there are opportunities for that cross-sectoral collaboration.
Thanks, Luthando. Yeah, so I see also Guy Midgley says all architects should be required to upskill on renewable design. And I think the thing is that we also need to, as conservationists and biodiversity scientists, we need to put ourselves out there, because it helps to be part of those forums, those architectural forums, those planning forums, because it's really, there's some really bright engineering minds out there, and we need to actually combine that with this good environmental science. And I've just found from discussing, some green infrastructure around Kruger, that more recently our quantity surveyors in South Africa, part of their sort of bill of quantities has to actually also have a full carbon audit on builds. So they have to be trained in full carbon auditing, life cycle analysis, and they have to provide that. And so I think there is things happening slowly, but we're not necessarily aware of what's going on in some of the other sectors and how we pull that together. And see, and because I think also people do need, I think that's what some of the things that are coming out in the chat, is people want to see some positive examples of where things are happening on the ground, and it's galvanizing change. So in terms of our questions, how are we doing? I don't know if there's any burning questions.
Annie,
We've got about a minute left to go.
Yeah.
Neville, what do
Sorry,
you
carry
think?
on.
Can we take one or two more?
I think we should rather not. We can always have a follow-up event if necessary. I think we should just wrap up if we can, please.
Okay. Okay, lovely. So I want to actually thank all the speakers. It's been wonderful actually having you. It's been wonderful to be part of this community. I think it's brilliant to see such an active sort of community of people interested in this type of work. Thank you to Neville and Wendy for both, mentioning both the sort of the further talks that are lined up, and hopefully we'll see some of you and continue some of these kinds of conversations then. Thank you for your time, Tim, Luthando, Nicola, Wendy, and Neville, and to everybody else. I know we've run over by 15 minutes, so thanks so much.
Thank you, Danny, for chairing this session so ably and well. It really has been a juicy debate and really fantastic talks. Greatly appreciated. And again, lovely to see you guys all.
Thanks from me, everybody. Thanks to all of them. Thank you to Wendy, especially for helping put this together. And yeah, we'll be announcing the further events. Our next event will be on the cryosphere, as I said. Arctic and Antarctic ice melts. So that's it. I think we should leave it and go and partake in Friday afternoon traditions. So thanks, Tim, Nicola, Danny, Luthando, and Wendy. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Great to see
Lovely
you.
to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye. Thank you.